It was just after midnight when David Miller saw something he was never supposed to see. The little shoe shop on Main Street had been closed for hours, but a faint light was coming from behind the building. David slowed his car. Then he saw Samuel Reed. The 68-year-old cobbler was standing alone behind his shop, digging into the frozen ground. At first, David thought Samuel was getting rid of some old piece of junk. Then Samuel opened a wooden box and pulled out a child's shoe. David watched as the old man carefully placed it into the ground. Then he pulled out a worn woman's shoe. After that came an old man's work boot. 3 shoes, 3 different people, and as far as David knew, Samuel had no reason to keep any of them together. But Samuel was not finished. He walked back into the dark shop and returned with the tools he had used for nearly 40 years. His hammer, his awls, his stitching needles, his leather knife, the tools that had built his entire life. David stood there in the darkness, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Why would an old cobbler bury 3 shoes belonging to 3 different people at midnight? Why would he bury the tools that had supported him for most of his adult life? And why was Samuel looking at those 3 shoes as if he were saying goodbye to people he had once known very well? David could have driven away. He almost did. But the next morning, he walked into Samuel's shop and asked just one question. "What were you burying last night?" Samuel stared at him for a long moment. Then he locked the front door. He reached beneath his old workbench and pulled out a wooden box that had been hidden there since 1986. Inside the box was a 40-year-old handwritten ledger, an old letter, 3 shoes, and a secret whose first clue Samuel had kept safe for 40 years. A secret that connected David's own family to a woman who had suddenly disappeared 4 decades earlier. A secret David's father had never known. And before that morning was over, David was going to learn why his grandmother had left her old shoe and her young son's shoe at Samuel's shop in E.G. by Luke, why she had never come back for them, and why that secret had remained silent inside a small wooden box for 4 decades. But Samuel had made one mistake. He had believed he could bury the secret with himself. He had forgotten that someone was watching, and that someone was not a stranger. He was that woman's grandson. By the time David Miller walked into Samuel Reed's shop the next morning, the old cobbler had already put away the shovel. The frozen ground behind the shop looked almost untouched. Almost. A narrow patch of dark earth remained beside the back wall, where the snow had been pushed aside during the night. David had driven past the shop shortly after midnight. He had seen the light. He had seen Samuel digging, and he had seen the 3 shoes. Now he stood inside the shop, watching the old man move slowly behind his workbench. Samuel looked tired. Not simply tired from a night's work. He looked like a man who had spent the night carrying something heavier than a shovel. David glanced toward the back door, then back at Samuel. "What were you burying last night?" Samuel did not answer right away. He looked down at the workbench. His hands rested beside the old hammer he had used for most of his adult life. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Then Samuel reached beneath the bench. He pulled out a wooden box. The box was old enough that the corners had been worn smooth by years of handling. David had seen plenty of old things in Samuel's shop. He had never seen this. Samuel placed the box on the workbench. And 40 years earlier, when Samuel Reed was 28 years old, that same box had not yet existed. His shop was smaller then. The wooden counter was newer. The brass cash register still shone when the afternoon light reached it. A wall telephone hung beside the workbench. A fluorescent light buzzed above the counter, and a thick handwritten ledger sat open near Samuel's elbow almost every day. Samuel recorded every order carefully. Names, dates, measurements, payments, repairs. He believed that if a customer trusted him with a pair of shoes, the least he could do was remember whose shoes they were. One snowy afternoon in 1986, the bell above the front door rang. Samuel looked up. A young woman entered with a little boy beside her. The woman looked to be in her early 30s. Her name was Eleanor Miller. The boy was 4 years old. Thomas. He stayed close to his mother as they approached the counter. Samuel noticed that Eleanor kept looking toward the front window. Whenever a car passed outside, her eyes followed it. When the bell rang again, as another customer left, she glanced toward the door. She tried not to make it obvious. Samuel noticed anyway. He simply did not ask. Eleanor placed 2 old shoes on the counter. One was hers. The other belonged to Thomas. She explained that money was tight and that she needed new shoes for both of them. Samuel picked up the child's shoe. He examined the worn leather and the shape of the sole. Then he examined Eleanor's shoe. He measured both carefully. "These will work as fitting references," Samuel told her. "I'll use the old shoes to get the size and shape right." Eleanor nodded. Samuel continued, "When the new shoes are finished and you come back for them, I'll return these to you." That seemed to matter to her. She looked at the 2 old shoes for a moment before answering. "All right." Samuel opened his ledger. He wrote Eleanor Miller, then the date, then Thomas's measurements, then the amount Eleanor had paid in advance. He explained that because the shoes were being made to the measurements, he would need some time to finish them properly. Eleanor thanked him. Thomas looked at the rows of shoes behind the counter. Samuel noticed the boy watching a small wooden shoe form on the shelf. "You like that one?" Thomas nodded. Samuel picked it up and placed it on the counter. "It's smaller than your shoe." Thomas looked at it, then at Samuel. "Mine will be bigger soon." Samuel smiled. "Probably sooner than you think." For a moment, Eleanor looked almost relaxed. Then her eyes moved toward the window again. Samuel noticed. He said nothing. Eleanor took Thomas's hand. They walked toward the door. She had almost stepped outside when she stopped. She turned around. Samuel was still standing behind the counter. There was something different in her face now. Not panic. Not exactly. More like a decision she had been trying to make before she walked into the shop. Samuel waited. Eleanor looked at Thomas, then back at him. "If I don't come back, will you keep the old shoes safe?" Samuel looked at the 2 shoes on the counter. He assumed she meant that she might have to leave town for a while. "Of course." Eleanor did not move. Then she said something Samuel would remember for the rest of his life. "If Thomas ever comes asking about me, don't tell him anything about the family trouble." Samuel's expression changed slightly. He still did not know what family trouble meant. Eleanor continued, "Not until he's old enough to decide for himself whether he wants to know." Samuel could have asked her what had happened. He could have asked where she was going. He could have asked why she seemed afraid. But Eleanor was holding her son's hand tightly, and Samuel understood that she was not asking him to solve anything. She was asking him to keep 2 old shoes safe. So he gave her the only answer he felt he could give. "I will." Eleanor nodded. "Thank you." Then she left with Thomas. Samuel watched them disappear through the snowy window. He expected to see them again. The new shoes were already in progress. Eleanor had paid part of the cost. Samuel finished them as promised. He placed the completed shoes on a shelf behind the counter and waited for her to return. She never did. Not the next day. Not the next week. Not the week after that. After several weeks, Samuel began asking quiet questions around town. Nobody seemed to know much. One person thought Eleanor might have gone to stay with relatives. Someone else thought she had moved. Another person simply did not know. Samuel eventually stopped asking, but he remembered the promise. He took Eleanor's old shoe and Thomas's little shoe and placed them inside a wooden box. He kept the box beneath his workbench. He did not put the new shoes inside. Those belonged to the unfinished business of a customer who had never returned. The old shoes were different. Those were the things Eleanor had specifically asked him to protect. At 28, Samuel could not imagine the shop still standing 40 years later. He certainly could not imagine that those 2 old shoes would still be beneath his workbench when his hair had turned gray. For a while, Eleanor's disappearance remained nothing more than an unanswered question. Then, several months later, a local construction worker named Richard Hale entered the shop. Samuel already knew him by sight. Richard had worked around town for years. Samuel had even seen him near Eleanor's house. Once, Richard had repaired a broken porch step there. Another time, Samuel had seen him carrying groceries toward her front door. Nothing about those moments had seemed unusual. In a small town, neighbors helped one another. Samuel had no reason to believe there was anything more to it. Richard was simply a man Samuel had seen around town. That afternoon, Richard carried an old work boot into the shop. Not a pair, just one boot. He explained that he had no use for it anymore and needed a little money. Samuel turned it over in his hands. The leather was worn from hard work. The sole was marked from construction sites and rough ground. Samuel offered him a small amount. Richard accepted. Samuel opened the ledger and recorded the purchase. 1 worn work boot. 1 transaction. Nothing more. He placed the boot in a storage area beneath the counter because it had no matching pair and no immediate use in the shop. He did not think about Eleanor. He did not think about Thomas. And he certainly did not think about the promise he had made months earlier. For Samuel, the 2 events had nothing to do with each other. A mother had left 2 old shoes for fitting references and never returned. A construction worker had sold him a single worn boot. That was all. Years later, Samuel would remember how ordinary both moments had seemed. That was what made the truth so difficult. Nothing about those objects had announced what they would eventually mean. The years moved on. Samuel worked. The town changed. The old telephone remained on the wall. The ledger filled with names. Customers came and went. Children grew into adults. Businesses opened. Other businesses closed. And beneath Samuel's workbench, the wooden box remained exactly where he had left it. He almost never opened it. He did not need to. He remembered what was inside. Eleanor's worn shoe, Thomas's little shoe, and nothing else. The single work boot was somewhere else in the shop. It had been kept simply because Samuel had never found a reason to throw it away. For decades, that was all it was. 3 ordinary objects existing in the same small shop for entirely ordinary reasons. There was no secret plan, no hidden connection, Samuel understood. No reason for him to put the boot together with the 2 old shoes. And no reason for him to believe that the 3 objects would one day tell the same story. Then time did what it always does. It made old things important. By the time Samuel reached 68, his hands had begun to ache after long days at the bench. His eyesight was not what it had been. He had started thinking about retirement. Not immediately, but enough to wonder what would happen to the shop when he could no longer stand behind the counter every morning. One afternoon, while sorting through his old business records, Samuel opened a ledger he had not touched in years. He turned one page, then another. Names he remembered, names he had forgotten. Repairs, payments, orders, and then he saw it. Eleanor Miller. Samuel stopped, turning the pages. For a long moment, he simply looked at her name. He remembered the snowy afternoon. He remembered Thomas standing beside her. He remembered her looking toward the window. And then he remembered the promise. Samuel closed the ledger. He opened it again. He looked at the date. 40 years had passed. The thought unsettled him. Not because he suddenly believed there was some great mystery waiting to be solved. He simply realized something else. If he died without ever finding out what happened to Eleanor, the wooden box might disappear with him. The shoes might be thrown away by someone who had no idea why they mattered, and a promise he had kept for 40 years might become meaningless simply because nobody was left who remembered why it had been made. So, Samuel decided to look. Quietly, carefully, he went to the local library. He searched old newspapers. He checked town records. He read through microfilm from the years surrounding 1986. There was no quick answer, no single record that explained everything. But after days of searching, Samuel found Eleanor Miller's name again. This time, it was in an obituary. She had died years earlier. Samuel sat quietly in the library. He read the notice twice. Then, he found the information about her surviving family. Thomas had grown up. He had married. He had a son, David Miller. Samuel knew that name. David had been coming into his shop for years. He had stood at the same counter. He had brought in worn shoes. He had talked about his father. And Samuel had never realized that the little boy Eleanor had brought into his shop in 1986 had been David's father. The discovery changed something. Not the promise, not yet, but the meaning of the old box. Samuel returned to his shop. He opened the ledger again. Then he looked for Richard Hale. He found his name. He checked the date of the boot sale. Then he went back to the town records. Richard had remained in the area for a time before eventually leaving. The dates overlapped with the period when Eleanor disappeared. Samuel remembered Richard carrying groceries to Eleanor's door. He remembered the broken porch step. He remembered the old work boot. But Samuel did not allow himself to draw a conclusion. A coincidence was not proof. A memory was not proof. A name in a ledger was not proof. He closed the book. Then he looked beneath the workbench. For the first time in 40 years, Samuel wondered whether the promise Eleanor had asked him to make had protected Thomas from the truth, or whether it had simply allowed the truth to disappear with her. He did not know yet, but now he had a reason to keep looking, and somewhere beneath his workbench, 2 old shoes were waiting. Somewhere else in the shop, a worn work boot was waiting too. Samuel had spent 40 years believing they were separate pieces of an ordinary past. He was beginning to realize that they might belong to the same story. Eleanor Miller never came back for the shoes. For the first few days, Samuel told himself there was probably a simple explanation. Maybe Thomas had gotten sick. Maybe Eleanor had found another way to pay for the new shoes. Maybe some family problem had delayed her. Samuel had been 28 years old in 1986. He had been running the little shop long enough to understand that people sometimes disappeared from their routines without explanation. A missed pickup did not necessarily mean a tragedy. So, he waited. The new shoes he had promised to prepare remained unfinished on the workbench. He had already measured Thomas carefully and written the measurements in his ledger. Eleanor's old shoe and Thomas's old child's shoe remained exactly where she had left them. He did not throw them away. He had promised not to. A week passed. Then another. Samuel eventually finished the work he could finish. But he never had the chance to hand the new shoes to Eleanor. He asked a few questions around town, carefully and without making Eleanor's private business public. Nobody knew much. One person thought she might have gone to stay with relatives. Another had heard that she was dealing with trouble at home. Neither answer was certain. Samuel stopped asking. Not because he had stopped wondering. Because Eleanor had asked him to keep Thomas out of the family trouble until the boy was old enough to decide for himself whether he wanted to know. Samuel understood only one thing clearly. Whatever had frightened her, she had trusted him enough to leave something behind. So he placed the 2 old shoes inside a small wooden box beneath his workbench. He did not write Eleanor's name on the outside. He simply closed the lid. For years, that was where the matter ended. Then Richard Hale walked into the shop. It happened several months after Eleanor had disappeared from Samuel's daily life. Richard was a local construction worker, somewhere around 40, with the rough hands and permanently dusty boots of a man who spent most of his days working outside. Samuel knew him casually. He had seen Richard around town. He had also seen him around Eleanor's house before she disappeared. Once, Richard had been repairing a broken porch step. Another time, Samuel had seen him carrying groceries toward Eleanor's front door. Nothing about either memory had seemed unusual. In a small Pennsylvania town, People helped each other. Samuel had never assumed there was more to it. That afternoon, Richard came into the shop carrying one worn work boot. Not a pair, just one. The boot was badly used, with creases across the leather and a sole that had seen better days. Richard explained that he no longer needed it and asked whether Samuel would buy it for a small amount. Samuel looked it over. It was still useful as leather, and the construction was solid despite the wear. They agreed on a modest price. Samuel recorded the transaction in his handwritten ledger. Richard left. Samuel put the single boot aside until he decided what to do with it. Later that day, while clearing a little space beneath the workbench, he noticed the wooden box. For practical reasons, he opened it. Eleanor's old shoe was inside. Thomas's little shoe was beside it. Samuel looked at the two shoes for a moment. Then he looked at the single work boot Richard had just purchased. The thought occurred to him that the three pieces of footwear had nothing to do with one another, so he did not put the boot in the box. He kept it separately, with other unused leather and shop materials. At that moment, there was no reason to connect them. There was only an old promise, 2 abandoned shoes, and 1 worn boot sold by a construction worker who needed a little extra money. Nothing more. Years passed. The shop changed slowly. The fluorescent light above the bench was replaced. The cash register grew older. The telephone on the wall was used less often as other ways of communicating became common. Customers came and went. Some returned for decades. Others appeared only once. Samuel's hair turned gray. His hands became slower. But the wooden box remained beneath the workbench. The 2 shoes stayed inside. The single work boot eventually found its way into a storage area with other old materials. Samuel rarely thought about any of them. He had made a promise when he was 28. For many years, he believed keeping the promise meant doing nothing. He did not search for Eleanor. He did not search for Thomas. He simply kept what she had asked him to keep. Then, in 2026, something changed. Samuel was 68. He had begun sorting through old business records because he knew there would eventually come a time when he could no longer keep the shop open. He was not planning a dramatic retirement. He simply wanted to understand what would happen to decades of ledgers, receipts, tools, and customer records if he was no longer behind the counter. One cold afternoon, he opened an old ledger and saw a name he had not read in years. Eleanor Miller. Samuel stopped turning the pages. There was the date, December 1986. There was Thomas's name beneath hers. 4 years old. The measurements Samuel had written down himself. For several seconds, he did nothing. Then he closed the ledger. A few minutes later, he opened it again. The memory came back in pieces. Eleanor, standing near the door, her eyes moving toward the street whenever a car passed. Thomas, sitting nearby, with his small feet not quite touching the floor. The way Eleanor had hesitated before asking Samuel to keep the shoes. Samuel looked toward the wooden box beneath his bench. For 40 years, he had accepted that he might never know what happened. But now he was 68. The thought of leaving the question unanswered had become different. When he was 28, 40 years had seemed impossible. At 68, 40 years was the distance between one generation and the next. Samuel began with the simplest place he could think of. The public library. He did not search for Eleanor because he suddenly believed there was a mystery to solve. He searched because he wanted to know whether she had lived long enough to see her son grow up. He spent several afternoons with old newspapers and microfilm. There were no shortcuts. He turned through page after page of local notices, marriage announcements, community news, and obituaries. Eventually, he found Eleanor. Not in the way he had imagined. Her name appeared in an obituary published years after she had left Samuel's shop. Samuel read it twice. She had lived far longer than he had assumed. She had eventually died after building a life somewhere beyond the town where he had known her. And the obituary contained one detail that made him sit back in his chair. Her surviving son was named Thomas Miller. Samuel knew the name immediately, the 4-year-old boy from the shop. The boy whose shoe was still inside a wooden box beneath his workbench. Samuel continued reading. Thomas had grown up. He had married. He had a son. The son's name was David Miller. Samuel stared at the page. David, his regular customer, the man who had been walking into Samuel's shop for years. The little boy from 1986 had become the father of a man Samuel knew personally. Samuel folded his hands over the newspaper. He thought about all the times David had stood across the same counter, all the times Samuel had repaired his shoes, all the ordinary conversations they had shared. Weather, work, family. Nothing had ever seemed strange. Yet David had been connected to Eleanor all along. He simply had not known that Samuel was holding part of her past beneath the workbench. Samuel returned to the ledger. This time, he looked at Eleanor's entry differently. Then another name came to mind. Richard Hale. Samuel found the old ledger entry for the single worn work boot. He remembered the afternoon Richard had sold it. He remembered seeing him around Eleanor's house. That memory alone meant nothing. But Samuel had learned something in 40 years. A memory could point toward a question. It could not answer it. So, he went back to the library. He searched old town records and newspaper listings from the years surrounding Eleanor's disappearance. The records showed that Eleanor had remained in the area for a period after Eat Seen Jobai Bashanus, before her name eventually disappeared from local records. Richard Hale had also been documented in the same area during that period. One old property-related notice placed Richard's name in the same part of town during a time when Eleanor was still listed locally. The dates overlapped. The information was real, but it was not enough. Samuel sat with the copies spread across the table. Eleanor, Richard, the years after. He could see a pattern beginning to form, but he could not yet tell what the pattern meant. There was no record saying what had happened between them. No newspaper article explained why Eleanor had left. No public document answered the question Samuel had carried for 40 years. And the fact that Richard had once helped Eleanor around her home still did not prove anything. Samuel leaned back in the library chair. For the first time, he allowed himself to consider a possibility he had never seriously entertained. Perhaps the 2 shoes beneath his workbench and the single worn work boot in his storage area were not entirely separate memories. He did not know that they belonged to the same story, but now he had a reason to wonder. That evening, Samuel returned to the shop after closing. The street outside was quiet. He turned on the light above his workbench and stood there for a long time. Then he opened the wooden box. He lifted Thomas's small shoe first. He remembered the boy asking whether Samuel was going to fix it. Then he picked up Eleanor's old shoe. He remembered her promise. Finally, Samuel walked to the storage area and brought back Richard's worn work boot. He placed all three objects on the workbench. For 40 years, they had existed as separate things. A child's shoe, a woman's shoe, a man's work boot. Now, for the first time, Samuel looked at them together. He still did not have the answer, but he had enough evidence to know that he could no longer call the connection impossible. And beneath the questions about Richard, Eleanor, and Thomas was the question that mattered most. Why had Eleanor been so afraid that she wanted Samuel to protect her son's old shoe until he was old enough to ask for the truth himself? Samuel looked again at the wooden box. He had spent 40 years keeping a promise. Now he needed to understand what that promise had really been protecting. And somewhere in the old records of Eleanor Miller's family, there might still be one piece of her story that could answer that question. Samuel did not sleep well that night. He stayed in the apartment above the shop with the old ledger on the table beside him, though he never opened it again. The town had gone quiet hours earlier. Outside, an occasional car passed along Main Street, its headlights briefly moving across the ceiling. Samuel kept thinking about Eleanor, not the woman from the old photograph, not the name in the newspaper, the woman who had stood in his shop 40 years earlier with a 4-year-old boy beside her and 2 old shoes in her hands. She had been frightened. Samuel knew that much. What he did not know was what she had been frightened of. The next morning, he unlocked the shop before 8. For a while, he simply stood behind the counter. The familiar smell of leather and polish filled the room. His tools were still arranged across the workbench, exactly as he had left them the night before. He opened the ledger. The pages from December 1986 were yellowed now, but the handwriting was unmistakably his. There was Eleanor's name. Below it, the note he had written after she left. New shoes for Eleanor and Thomas. Old shoes kept as fitting references. Return when new pairs are collected. Samuel stared at that sentence. The shoes had never been meant to stay. Eleanor had left them because Samuel needed accurate references for the new shoes. She had expected to return. But before she could, she had come back into the shop one final time and asked him to keep the old shoes safe if she did not. That distinction mattered. The shoes had not been abandoned. They had been entrusted. Samuel closed the ledger. Over the next several days, he returned to the local library. He had already spent time looking through old newspapers, but now he knew what he was searching for. Not an answer, a timeline. The microfilm machine hummed softly as he moved through old editions. Eleanor's name appeared more than once after 1986. There was an address notice, a small community announcement. Later, a change of residence. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that explained why she had disappeared from Samuel's life. But it proved something important. Eleanor had remained in the area after the night she left his shop. She had not simply vanished the next morning. She had lived there for several more years. Samuel copied the last address into his notebook. Then He searched the town records. That was where Richard Hale's name appeared again. Richard had worked construction in the same part of the county during those years. A property record placed him within the same general area where Eleanor had lived. The dates overlapped. For years, Samuel sat quietly at the library table. He looked from one record to the other. Nothing on those pages proved a relationship. Nothing proved that Richard had been involved in Eleanor's disappearance. Nothing even proved that the two had been close. But the overlap was no longer something Samuel could dismiss. He remembered Richard differently now. Not as a suspicious man, just as a tired construction worker who had once walked into his shop carrying one worn work boot. One boot, not a pair. The leather had been badly scuffed, and the sole had started separating near the heel. Richard had asked if Samuel could repair it. Samuel had told him the repair would cost more than the boot was worth. Richard had looked at the boot, then nodded. Fair enough. He had sold it to Samuel for a small amount. Samuel had kept it because the leather was still useful. There had never been anything strange about the transaction. That was precisely why Samuel trusted his memory of it. He had not thought Richard was important. He had not thought Eleanor was connected to him. And he certainly had not known what the future would make of either one. A coincidence was not proof. A memory was not proof. An old work boot was not proof. So Samuel kept looking. The answer he found next was harder to sit with. An old newspaper obituary confirmed that Eleanor had died years after leaving town. Samuel read the notice twice. Then he saw Thomas's name. Her son had grown up. He had married. He had built a life of his own. And he had a son, David. Samuel put the newspaper down. For several seconds, he did nothing. The little boy who had once stood beside Eleanor in his shop had become the father of a man Samuel had known for years. David had brought boots into the shop. He had asked Samuel to repair shoes. He had stood at this same counter, talking about ordinary things. Once, years earlier, David had mentioned that his father preferred repairing old things instead of replacing them. Samuel had smiled at the time. Now, the memory stayed with him. There had been no reason to ask questions then. There was a reason now. Samuel returned to the library the following afternoon. The librarian told him that some of Eleanor's family papers had been donated to the local historical archive after her death. The papers had not been donated by Eleanor. They had belonged to her sister. After Eleanor died, some of her personal belongings had remained with her sister, who kept them in the family for years. Eventually, the collection was given to the archive, along with photographs, church papers, receipts, and other ordinary family documents. The librarian brought Samuel the folder. Most of it was exactly what he expected. Photographs, receipts, a few handwritten notes. Then Samuel saw an envelope. It had Eleanor's handwriting on the front. He knew it immediately. The envelope had never been mailed. That was why it had survived. Eleanor had written the letter, addressed it to her sister, and placed it among her personal papers instead of sending it through the post. After her death, her sister had kept it with the rest of Eleanor's belongings. Years later, it had entered the archive with everything else. There had been no secret vault, no hidden hand, just a letter that had never reached the mailbox. Samuel opened it carefully. The paper inside was dated in the same period as Eleanor's final visits to his shop. That mattered. She had written it while the fear, Samuel remembered, was still fresh. The letter was not long. There was no accusation, no dramatic confession. Eleanor wrote that Thomas was not the child Richard's family believed him to be. Then she named Richard Hale. Samuel stopped reading. He read the sentence again. Richard was Thomas's biological father. Eleanor wrote that Richard knew Thomas existed. She did not describe him as a monster. She did not accuse him of a crime. What frightened her was what would happen if the adults around Thomas made his choices for him before he was old enough to understand them. She wanted Thomas to grow up first. She wanted him to know the truth when he was old enough to decide what that truth meant. That was why she had asked Samuel to keep the shoes safe. That was why she had asked him not to tell Thomas while he was still a child. Samuel read the final pages slowly. Eleanor had not asked him to erase Richard. She had not asked him to lie forever. She had asked him to protect Thomas until the boy was old enough to make his own decision. Samuel folded the letter and held it between both hands. For 40 years, he had remembered the promise differently. He had thought he was protecting a secret. Now he understood that Eleanor had been trying to protect a choice, and he had never known when Thomas had become old enough to make it. That was the part Samuel could not settle. Thomas had grown up. Thomas had become a husband, a father, David's father. And Samuel had remained silent through all of it, because he had never been certain whether speaking would honor Eleanor's wishes or betray them. He looked at the letter again. Then he returned to the shop. The wooden box was still beneath the workbench. Samuel opened it. Inside were the two objects Eleanor had entrusted to him: her old shoe and Thomas's small child's shoe. Nothing else. The Richard Hale work boot was not there. Samuel had kept that separately, wrapped in old paper on a storage shelf, because it had never belonged with Eleanor's belonging. He brought it down now. He placed the single worn boot on the workbench beside the open wooden box. For the first time, he could see all three objects together. Not because he had always known they belonged together, because 40 years of records, memories, and one unfinished letter had finally given him a reason to place them side by side. 3 pieces of footwear, 3 ordinary objects, and one family story none of them could explain by themselves. Samuel did not pretend he knew everything. He still did not know exactly why Eleanor had left when she did. He did not know what Richard had said to her. He did not know what Thomas would have chosen if he had learned the truth as a young man. But he knew enough now to understand that the silence had gone on too long. Samuel folded Eleanor's letter and placed it beside the ledger. Then he looked toward the front window. David had been standing in that shop for years. He had never known what was beneath the workbench. He had never known what his grandmother had asked Samuel to protect. Samuel could no longer make that decision for him. He would speak to David, but he would not tell David what to believe. He would not decide what Richard meant to his family. He would not tell him how he was supposed to feel about Eleanor. He would simply show him what had survived: the letter, the 2 shoes, the single worn work boot, and the truth. Eleanor had trusted someone to protect until her son was old enough to choose what to do with it. Samuel closed the wooden box. He left his cobbler's tools where they belonged. on the workbench. The next step would not be easy. But for the first time in 40 years, Samuel knew what it had to be. The truth could not remain buried simply because he was afraid of what it might change. Tomorrow, he would ask David to sit down with him. And this time, Samuel would keep the promise by finally letting the family decide what to do with the truth. The next morning, Samuel unlocked the shop before 8. For 40 years, he had opened the same door, turned on the same lights, and listened to the same small bell announce the beginning of another day. This morning felt different. The wooden box was beneath the counter. Richard Hale's single, worn work boot rested separately on the workbench, and Eleanor's letter lay inside a clean envelope beside Samuel's ledger. He had barely slept, not because the letter had frightened him, because it had finally answered the question he had carried for 40 years. What had Eleanor meant when she asked him to keep those shoes safe? She had not asked him to hide the truth forever. She had asked him to protect Thomas until he was old enough to decide what he wanted to know. Samuel had always assumed that moment was somewhere in Thomas's future. But time had made the decision for him. Thomas was gone. He had lived his life, raised his son, and died before Samuel ever understood what Eleanor had been trying to protect him from. Samuel had never been given the chance to speak to Thomas, and now there was only one person left who could decide what to do with the truth: David. At 8:20, the bell above the door rang. David Miller walked in carrying a pair of brown work shoes. "Morning, Sam." "Morning." David placed the shoes on the counter. The heels started coming loose. Samuel picked one up and turned it over. For a moment, he simply looked at the worn leather. Then he placed it back down. "There's something I need to show you." David noticed the seriousness in his voice. "Something wrong?" "No." Samuel paused. "Something old." David waited. Samuel reached beneath the counter and brought out the wooden box. David looked at it. "What's that?" "Something your grandmother left with me." The words seemed to catch David off guard. "My grandmother? Eleanor." David slowly sat down. He had known her mostly through stories. A name, a photograph, a few scattered memories from family conversations that had never quite formed a complete picture. Samuel opened the box. Inside were 2 old shoes. One belonged to Eleanor. The other was a child's shoe, small enough to fit inside David's hand. David stared at it. "That's my father's." Samuel nodded. "He was 4 years old when your grandmother brought it here." David did not touch it. "How long have you had these?" 40 years. "Why?" "Because she asked me to keep them safe." David looked at Samuel. What was she afraid of? Samuel took a breath. "I didn't know then, and now I know more." That answer was enough to make David look toward the envelope. Samuel placed it on the counter. "Your grandmother wrote this." David stared at the handwriting. "How do you know?" "It was found among your great-aunt's preserved family papers." The papers were donated to the local historical archive years later. The envelope was still sealed. It was never mailed. David picked it up carefully. "You've read it?" "Yes." "How do you know it's really hers?" Samuel pointed toward the page. "The handwriting matches the notes she left in the old records. The date is from the same period." and the archive preserved the original envelope with the papers. David was quiet. He opened it. Samuel did not watch the words. He watched David. At first, David's expression barely changed. Then he stopped. Read the same paragraph again. His eyes remained on the page. Richard Hale. Samuel said nothing. David continued reading. Finally, he lowered the letter. Richard Hale was my father's biological father. That's what Eleanor wrote. David looked at him. You believe her? Samuel answered carefully. I believe she wrote it. I don't claim to know everything that happened between them. David looked back at the letter. What did my father know? I don't know. You never told him? I never had the chance. David looked up. What do you mean? Your father died before I found the letter. The room went quiet. David looked down. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then, when? Several years ago. You knew him all those years. Yes. And you never told him? Samuel did not defend himself. I didn't know what I was supposed to tell him. David's expression tightened. You had the shoes? I had a promise. But you didn't know what the promise meant. Not completely. David stood and walked toward the window. Outside, Main Street was beginning its ordinary morning. A pickup passed. A woman carried a paper grocery bag toward her car. Nothing in the town looked different. David kept looking outside. My father never talked about his mother. Samuel remembered that. He didn't talk much about the years before he married. David turned. He told you that? Not directly. You mentioned it once. David looked confused. When? A long time ago. You brought in a pair of your father's shoes for repair. David gave a faint smile. That sounds like him. He liked things repaired instead of replaced. David looked at the workbench. So did you. Samuel almost smiled. I suppose I did. David returned to the counter. What happened between Eleanor and Richard? I don't know. Did Richard abandon her? I don't know. Did he hurt her? I have no evidence that he did. David studied Samuel. You really don't know? No. That answer seemed to matter. Samuel continued. What I know is what Eleanor chose to put in that letter. She said Richard was your father's biological father. She said she wanted Thomas to grow up before deciding what that truth meant to him. David lowered his eyes. So she wasn't trying to erase Richard? No. Then why didn't she tell my father? Maybe she was afraid that knowing too soon would change the life he was still trying to build. David looked at the letter. She wanted him to choose. Yes, and he never got the chance. Samuel's voice was quiet. Not from me. David looked at him. Samuel did not look away. I thought keeping quiet was the safest way to honor what she asked. And now? Now I understand that the person she wanted to choose is gone. He glanced at the letter, but the choice didn't disappear with him. David understood. It was his turn. Not to rewrite his father's life. Not to decide whether Richard had been good or bad. Only to decide whether he wanted to know more. David sat down again. He read the final page. When he finished, he folded the letter carefully. I don't know what I'm supposed to feel. You don't have to decide today. David looked at the envelope. Do I hate Richard? Samuel shook his head. You don't know him. David nodded slowly. I guess that's the problem. No, Samuel said. That's the beginning. David looked at him. Samuel continued. If you want to know who he was, you can look. There are records, people who knew him, places where he worked. And if I don't, then you don't. David looked toward the wooden box. I think I want to know. Samuel nodded. But I don't want this to change what my father was. It doesn't. Richard was his biological father. Yes. But Thomas was the man who raised me. Samuel nodded. Your father is still your father. David looked down at the old child's shoe. That sentence seemed to settle something inside him. Not everything, just enough. Then his eyes moved toward the workbench. Richard's single worn work boot was still there. Is that his? Samuel nodded. How did you get it? Richard brought it into the shop in 1986. He needed money and didn't have any use for it anymore. Just one? Just one. David almost smiled. Samuel picked up the boot. He placed it beside the box. For years, he had kept the two shoes because Eleanor had asked him to. The boot had remained because he had never found a reason to throw it away. Now, all three objects sat together, not as proof of every detail, not as a complete explanation, just as pieces of a story that had taken 40 years to become visible. David reached for the wooden box. Can I take them? Samuel looked at him. Yes. He wrapped Eleanor's shoe and Thomas's shoe carefully in brown paper. Then he wrapped Richard's boot separately. David watched. You've taken good care of them. I tried. David hesitated. You could have told me sooner. Samuel nodded. I could have. Why didn't you? Samuel looked at his hands. Because I was afraid of being wrong. David waited. And because your father was alive for most of those years, I kept thinking the decision belonged to him. But you never found out. No. David looked down. Maybe he would have wanted to know. Maybe. And maybe he wouldn't have. Maybe. David picked up the wrapped shoes. For a moment, he seemed uncertain what to do with them. Then he held them against his chest. I think I'll take them home. Samuel nodded. They should be there. David looked at him. Thank you. Samuel gave a small nod. David walked toward the door. Before leaving, he stopped. Sam? Yes? If you had known what that letter said 40 years ago, would you have done anything differently? Samuel thought about the question. Then he answered honestly. I don't know. David nodded. That's probably the only answer anyone can give. The bell rang as he stepped outside. Samuel watched him cross Main Street and disappear around the corner. Then the shop became quiet. He looked at the wooden box. It was empty. For 40 years, that emptiness had belonged to him. Now it didn't. Samuel closed the lid and placed it beneath the counter. He did not lock it. There was no reason to anymore. He turned toward the workbench. His tools were still there. The hammer, the awls, the knives, the thread, the wooden last worn smooth by decades of work. He picked up David's damaged shoe. The heel had come loose. The leather was cracked near the edge. It was not beyond repair. Samuel sat down. He threaded the needle. Outside, The town continued with its ordinary morning. The past had not been erased. Eleanor had not returned. Thomas had not been given the choice she once wanted for him. But the truth had finally reached someone who could carry it forward. Samuel pressed the leather together and began to stitch. Slowly, carefully, the way he always had. And for the first time in 40 years, he no longer felt that keeping something safe meant keeping it hidden. Some things from the past are meant to be remembered. Some truths are meant to come home. And some things, after all those years, are still worth repairing. Some stories end with answers. The ones that matter most begin with understanding. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe for more untold stories. Until our next untold story, take care.